Hello world, this is Mike Jordan for the Jewish Diaspora Report. Welcome to our first episode. Let's get started. Thus said the Lord God of Israel to the whole community for which I have exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build your houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their fruit. Take wives and beget sons and daughters. Multiply there. Do not decrease. And seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you to, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its prosperity you shall prosper. This is from Jeremiah 29, and it's one of the most amazing references to the diaspora, which is what this podcast is going to be about. The word diaspora these days kind of takes on a more general context of sort of any group of people living outside of their ancestral homeland. But in our context, of course, we're going to discuss the Jewish diaspora, which has dated back somewhere around 722 BCE, before the Common Era, when the Assyrian Empire took over the Israelites and the Israelite nation and sent many of the Israelites into exile across the Assyrian Empire. And for the most part, aside from some people who claim that they are part of the original 10 tribes, or maybe that they have found the 10 tribes, they have, for the most part, been lost to history. Whereas we have a later Babylonian exile, which came when Babylon then conquered the southern kingdom of Judah. And in this case, it was very different. They held on very strongly to their beliefs and to their history and their heritage, and they never forgot about Israel. This is actually where the quote of Jeremiah that I had read comes from. This complex issue of living outside of your land that you've lived in since the beginning of your people. And how do you deal with that? When we come back from this break, we will get to starting on what this podcast is, what this podcast is not, and where we go from here. I think something great to speak about is sort of why this podcast, what is the purpose of it, what it is, what it isn't. My first thinking when I was creating a podcast, I saw this amazing quote from the ancient Jewish writer, scholar Josephus in his book Antiquities. He said, "It is good that they not be ignorant of one another, being members of the same race and partners in the same institutions. If they remain without ever coming in contact, they will be regarded by each other as absolute strangers." It's an interesting discussion in regards to diaspora Jews and the Jews who live in Israel. The idea being, of course, that if the Jews of the diaspora really never came in contact with the Jews of Israel, or frankly, with the situation going on in Israel, or even with one another when it comes to all of the countries and places that Jews are, we would essentially be strangers to one another. And that shouldn't be. I think Jews who've always been connected through culture, through religion, through ancestral ties, it would be very much a shame, as Josephus suggests, living in Rome in an exile himself. It suggests that all of Jews across the world should know one another, should be familiar with one another, should understand and connect with one another, nowadays more than ever, realizing the challenges that we all face. So part of this podcast is hoping to fulfill that prophecy from Josephus, that we not become strangers among each other living all over the world. So next step I was going to say is what this podcast is not. I figured it's easier to start with that. This podcast is definitely not a religious podcast. It is, despite using a few quotes, which I love to use, it is not something you are going to find necessarily a stronger faith. That's not my aim here. I am definitely not a rabbi. We're going to get into my biography a little later. We will be talking a little bit about politics. We're going to try to touch on that, but I guess that gets into what the podcast is. First and foremost, the podcast hopefully will be educational. It will bring communities together. It'll discuss issues that face these communities around the world. As we see maybe a rise in different tensions around the world, how that affects us, our communities. Most of all, we're going to try and keep this fair, balanced, and as much as we can apolitical. After this, we'll talk about me, my background, my biography, Thanks for sticking around on the Jewish Diaspora Podcast. Welcome back to the Jewish Diaspora Podcast. For this segment, we're going to talk a little bit about my history and background. I am a teacher of history in secondary schools. I also have a background and a BA in history, religion, and biblical studies. I have led numerous trips for educational purposes to Europe to study the history of the Jewish people during World War II. I have also led numerous trips to Israel for various facets like leadership, Israeli history, Jewish history, to try and show young adults to even adults the amazing things that Israel has to offer as a state, but also as the history and place, birthplace of the Jewish people. Lastly, and most importantly, of course, I was born Jewish. I am a practicing Jewish person. I frequently like to explore my Judaism in various ways. All of these incredible ways that I engage with Judaism, whether it's academically, religiously, it really does allow me to have a really cool view of all sides of these issues and hopefully be able to provide you guys with a little bit of perspective so that way we're not focusing on only one aspect that makes this religion and this culture and this history so vibrant. When we come back, we're going to discuss the big issue that's going to face this podcast from the start, which is Israel versus the Jews. You may be asking how those two things are different. Hang around and find out. The Jewish Diaspora Podcast will be right back. There is commonly a misunderstanding about Israel and about Jews that could go back for many, many centuries. The idea being that all Jews support Israel is a very misleading statement because this is ignoring a wide variety of Jews who have a moderate to no connection to the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel. And we also have to realize that not necessarily every Israeli is Jewish. There are large populations of people who are not Jewish living in the modern state of Israel today. So to suggest that all Jews are Israelis and all Israelis are Jews is completely not factual. Trying to paint the Jewish people as a singular view, a singular belief, a singular feeling towards one state or political regime really doesn't do us any help and any service. One way especially that communities are painted with a broad brush is that there is a strange belief that because Jews all support the state of Israel, which I've suggested is not accurate, that somehow those Jewish people who are unaffiliated with the state of Israel or really have disdain against the state of Israel somehow are always secretly under some suspicion for their connection to this Jewish state, just by simply being Jewish. It really is unfortunate because there is a double standard here where Jewish people are tied to a state that they may have little or no connection to, whereas many other people whose ancestors came from a certain land or their religion ties them to it really aren't held responsible for that government's actions or their decisions that they make on the ground in a country that many Jews have never even stepped foot in. So that's something I think we are going to talk about a little bit on this podcast. For those of you who have never stepped in Israel, those of you who support Israeli government decisions, don't support it. We're going to talk about all of these issues to keep you informed in order to fulfill Josephus' suggestion that we, as Jewish people around the world, do not remain strangers. Thanks. We'll see you next time.